In this video, we're going to explore the 3D content creation pipeline. So we're going to be using Autodesk Maya to model and create some 3D assets, and then bring those over into our little Unity scene here so that we can start creating kind of a interesting looking environment. So right now we have our gameplay set up where we have mouse aiming and firing with clicking the mouse, and then movement with WASD, and we can sort of collide with things and avoid this enemy who's going to walk around and just shoot at us. We can also hit these objects which are damaging. Okay, so the plan is to take a very simple scene right here, which doesn't have much interesting gameplay but just has a few elements, and to create some 3D assets which will give a little bit of interest and life to this scene. So the main pipeline that we're going to go through here is, like I said, content creation inside of Maya, and then we're going to import or export the models from Maya and import them into Unity, and then set them up inside of Unity with some simple materials. We're not going to go into material texture painting or creation of materials too deeply in this video. That's going to be in the next one. So we'll just focus on modeling techniques and how to bring in assets into your Unity project. And I'm going to keep this kind of informal and just sort of go at it, one thing at a time. I don't have a huge plan outline for this, but I know I want to create some environment assets, maybe in the low poly art style, and create a player, kind of a player asset that I can duplicate and change the color of for the enemy, and just keep things kind of simple and straightforward. I'm not going to go into any animation, although we are going to do some more sophisticated setup of our character where I can aim independently of moving, just because I want to show you how that parenting might work. But we might do that in a later video too. I'm not sure yet. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing to understand is how 3D content is created and how it's saved and then brought in to Unity. So Unity is not a content authoring tool. The content that we've been using so far, these primitive shapes, some of the built-in content, and these have meshes. You can click on the meshes here, but it won't take you anywhere because these are actually just built in to Unity. If you click the little target here, you can see Unity's created some simple meshes that are just easily reusable. These are the same, basically the same things that we're going to use, except we're going to build them from scratch, and I'm going to show you how to import them. So a mesh is a collection of vertices. If I click my player and open him up here, should be able to change it to the wireframe view. No, it doesn't look like I can. Well, a mesh like this is a collection of vertices and flat lines between those vertices. So let me get into Maya and I can show you kind of what this looks like under the hood. Okay, so in Maya, you're going to want to be in your poly modeling set of menus here. You're not really going to be in sculpting too much, and you're definitely not going to be in curves and surfaces. So make sure you're in poly modeling. And let's go ahead and just create a simple object. I'm going to create a sphere here. And we're going to change this. I just wanted to create this to show you what a polygonal object is. So I'm not going to go into details in Maya. I'm kind of assuming that you've spent some time in this program. If you haven't, and this is all new to you, just check some of the basic tutorials, either through, I think the help menu has some 1-minute tutorials, startup movies and tutorials here, or YouTube has just a ton of awesome tutorials. You can probably find some good ones there. So I'm going to assume you have the basic understanding of 3D modeling, but I do want to kind of share with you some of the important things to know and pay attention to when you're modeling for games. So games work on polygon-based objects. The way that rendering works in a game is that it collects the points in the scene of a mesh and figures out which mesh, which is the normal direction of that that particular face. We looked at normal, the normals when we were doing the mouse aiming. A normal is tangent to a face. So I can in Maya display the normals. If I go to polygons and show face normals. So these are the normals that are pointing out from each of the faces. So the rendering engine calculates the points and it figures out the normal, and then it basically shades and renders that that face with whatever the material specifies. So maybe there's a texture that has some detail on it. Maybe it's just a simple color. So you can see here that, let me go back and turn this off. There we go. If you turn this to wireframe view, you can see this is all a mesh really is. It's just vertices here, and then lines between those vertices, and you can go ahead and shift these around and modify your shapes, of course. So let's go back to object mode, turn shading back on. Okay. So you're always going to be working with polygon-based objects in games. Now, how you go about building them and structuring them and merging them together and maybe creating a hierarchy of multiple objects, that is where the fun comes in, and that's where Maya kind of excels at giving you tools to quickly create things and fancy ways to make things quickly. But at the end of the day, your meshes that you create in Maya and bring into Unity are always just going to be simple points and faces, vertices and faces. Okay, so now that we know that, let's create an object, just a simple cube. I'm going to go up to polymodeling and just hit create on this cube. And let's just bring one thing into Unity so you can see the pipeline coming from Maya into Unity. So in Maya, I'm going to create that cube and then go to the File menu. And it's usually a good idea to save your Maya scene. We're going to be exporting this as an object of a certain type, but it's a good idea to save in the native file format, a Maya binary or ASCII format, your scene. But just for this quick demo, I'm going to go down to export selection. I could choose export all, but I'm just going to do export selection with my cube selected. And then let's go to our desktop and let's save it just on the desktop. And this is the important part. I want to choose a different file type than the default. Now, Unity can actually read native Maya files, but it's kind of not a good idea to save them and import them as Maya files, because if a computer using the engine doesn't have Maya, there are issues that will surface where the models just disappear. So the file format that most games use for 3D models is an FBX file format. Now, depending on your install of Maya, this may not be an option that you see. So if it's not, and you need to enable the FBX option, you need to cancel out of here and come up to your, let's see, where is it? It's in the edit menu. No, where is it? Lost it. Hold on one second. Okay, there it is. It's in display. It's in Windows, Settings and Preferences, and then Plugin Manager. So if you don't see that FBX option, click on this set of windows and open up Plugin Manager, and then down near the bottom, I believe, is this FBX Maya MLL. that's probably not set to load on yours. So make sure both of these are selected and then close. And now go back, make sure this is selected. You haven't deselected that. File, export selection. And then let's go back to the desktop and type in the name. And then change your file type here from Maya binary down to FBX. And your export options will change here. These by default should be okay, and if we run into any problems we might want to change these. The one that you can get caught up on is this FBX plugin version. I know, for instance, that Unreal has a certain FBX plugin version, and if you import your models at a later version, you can run into issues. I think Unity is pretty current, but if you wanted to change this, you can go to Advanced Options and then FBX file format, and that's going to let you select all the way back to like 2006. So if you wanted, you can go back to like 2016, 2017 if you're having weird problems with your FBX models. Okay, some other options here. So you can choose some options with geometry, although these should be okay. You can choose to ignore the animation or include it. We don't have any animation set on here, so I'm not worried about it. We don't have a rig or anything like that either. So leaving this checked, I'm not worried about, but if you wanted to, you could deselect that. We'll leave it on just in case we do that in the future. And that's all. I just wanted to give you some options here. Bake animation is a really cool option. If you have animation that's on a control rig and you need it baked out on export, you can choose that. The rest of them are kind of okay to leave. Okay, so let's look at our desktop and figure out. Let's open it up here. So we have our cube here, and it's a 3D object type. Oh, I did want to say there is one other object file type that gets used sometimes. It's not used for animated models because it can't have a rig or anything like that, but it is a very simple, very easy to convert between different projects file type, and that's OBJ. So you can use FBX and OBJ. FBX is kind of the industry standard at this point. So we have cube here. It's a FBX file type, and if I want to import this into Unity, I can drag and drop it into my project just like this. I'm going to create a folder in the project first called models and open that up, and then let's go back and drag and drop that in. So now our cube is in the scene, or sorry, in the project. It's not in the scene yet. We can adjust some import settings such as the scale factor, and if we had animation on it, you know, a rig and animation set to none currently, we can do that. We also have materials. It has this Lambert material that was just put on there by default inside of Maya. If we had changed that, that would have been updated, and we can remap this if we wanted. So this is all very kind of basic. This is like the most primitive shape ever. So we're not going to see many options that we're going to need to change here. But the scale factor is something that's really useful to know about. And if you drag this into the scene, it's going to become apparent why. So I'm dragging and dropping it into the scene, but it looks like it's not working. In fact, it is working, and if I press F, you can see that it is in there. It is just super tiny, right? Almost invisible to the naked eye. So why is that? Well, it has to do with the native scale size that Maya uses versus the one that Unity uses. So in Unity, 1 unit is a meter. If we go ahead and create a 3D object that's a cube, this is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. In Maya, a single unit is a centimeter. So this is, you know, not 100 times smaller, it's 1,000 times smaller, whatever 100 by 100 is. So it's a fraction of the size. Now there are a few ways we can fix this. We can adjust it here inside the engine, or we can adjust it inside of Maya. And you will get mixed results depending on what you do. Let's do an export where we have tried to adjust the file size or the asset size inside of Maya, and I can show you kind of how it's different. So this is our Maya scene, and these are our centimeter units. We can change the default size here. Let's delete this actually. Let's change the default size to match Unity. So let's set 1 unit equal to 1 meter. We can do that by going to Windows, going to, I believe it is Settings and Preferences, and then going into Preferences. And then if we go to Settings, just this top menu here, we can change the working units from centimeter to meter. You can see in our scene that just blew everything up much bigger. And the rest of these are okay. You could change your FPS here if you wanted. That's where that setting is. So let's go ahead and save this. And then let's make a cube. And now this should be, because everything got increased, this should now be a meter. So let's export this and try it out. Let's do cube 1m for 1 meter. Let's go back into Unity and drag and drop this in, and then drag and drop this into the scene. And that looks like it's working, right? Because it's the same size, right? We set those units to be the same size. But what I've discovered is Unity is handling some sort of conversion here, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on. I think it's anticipating that there will be that scale difference and making some sort of calculation, because the scale here is set to 0.01. If we change this back to 1, now our cube is 100 meters by 100 meters. So this is confusing to me. I'm not sure exactly what is going on behind the scenes, but in my mind, it's worse to have a scale in the scene that's set to something weird that isn't set to 1 than it is to change this. And there is one other way to change this. So I'm clicking on my original cube, the one that's 1 centimeter. And if we click on the asset version of this, you can change the scale factor here to be to convert, or to kind of alter the normal scale. So if we put in 100 here and hit apply down at the bottom, now this cube that we brought in, the original cube, is going to be the correct size. And you can see here that there is this convert units thing going on. And maybe that has something to do with it. I really haven't investigated that much, because I usually just use the scale factor and increase this by a factor of 100. But maybe you can mess around and see whether this is doing something different on your end if you change these convert units. This is a new setting, actually. I haven't seen this until like recent versions of Unity. So maybe they're trying to make sense of this, and I just need to get caught up to speed. But basically, the takeaway here is that by default, Maya will be in units of centimeters, Unity will be in units of a meter, and either you need to change it by changing your scale factor, or one of the other options that I've kind of shown. Okay, so I'm gonna delete this, and I'm gonna actually go back to Maya and delete that and set this back to where was it? Settings, Preferences, Settings, and change this back to centimeters. Just because I don't want to deal with that weird scale, 001 scale or whatever it had. Okay, so those are the basics of moving between the two programs. Now I'm actually going to show you a kind of handier way of working. So let's say I have my scene here, and I'm going to save my scene now. Just on the desktop. I should put this in a folder that I kind of organized, but for now, put it on the desktop. And I'm going to call this player. And my player scene is going to include the assets, the meshes that I'm going to create that are going to be my player 3D model. So let's go ahead and I want to show you how there's kind of a faster way of working between Unity and Maya. And this is in the File menu. If you scroll down here, you can see there's actually a Send to Unity option here. And you can do Send to Unity All, which is going to do the whole scene. And you could do Send to Unity Selection, which is just going to take whatever you have selected. Those are both really useful options depending on kind of how you're working. To use this, though, you're going to need to set up your Unity project and set it here. So click on that, and then it says choose a Unity project to send FBX assets. So navigate to your project, and just as long as you're in this root directory, it should work. Click select, and now it's set. So now if I go to File, I have this selected by the way, go to Send to Unity and choosing Selection. Now it's going to open up my assets, and I don't have to sort of re-navigate through stuff. So that kind of makes this process a little bit faster. And it's also going to choose FBX options which are set up for the engine, which is nice. And I'm going to go to Models, and then if you wanted to overwrite an existing model, now all you have to do is click once, and then Export Selection. It's going to ask you, do you want to replace it? And you just hit yes. So now we've overwritten that. And Unity is super flexible with this. So if I'm in play mode and I'm like, okay, well, let me deselect or turn off my enemy. If I'm like, okay, I want to update this game object, this mesh in the scene with a new 3D model, I can go back to Maya and say, okay, this is going to be a cylinder now, and I'm going to do export or Send to Unity Selection, and then I'm going to overwrite this cube, replace it, and back in Unity. Now it has been updated. Now it's gone tiny again, so I'm going to have to change. Oh, no, it hasn't gone tiny. That's normal. Usually that works. Why didn't it work? Oh, okay. So usually you can update models in real time, and that'll pop in. But I guess maybe that's not the case anymore. Regardless, if you're not in play mode, you can just go ahead and choose different objects and then simply overwrite them, and it will update. So it's a fast way to work. Obviously there might be some limitations there, but that's kind of a quick way to work, which is cool. Okay, so let's actually let's not make the player first. Let's make an obstacle. I want to try and replace these these three things right here with something that kind of looks like a rock. So I'm going to create a simple shape, and instead of choosing one of these primitive shapes here, I'm going to use kind of the foundation of a lot of low poly games use polygons that have a different kind of style to them. They're triangulated a lot of times, and I'm going to make these rock type shapes out of these more triangulated meshes. So you can go here and click the platonic solid, or you can go up to the mesh menu and go to, where is it? Hold on, let me find something really. There we go, looking in the wrong place. So if you go to the create menu over here and go to polygon primitives, you can choose some additional shapes that aren't on the little hotbar. So platonic solid is cool, pyramid is cool, Prism, all this stuff might be super useful to you. I'm going to go Platonic Solid and then click the little options box. And from there you can choose different things like icosahedron or tetrahedron, things like that. And you can choose different subdivisions and whether it's using quads or triangles. I think some of these options are also available in your, they're available in the create component here. So you can go to your attribute editor and go to your polyplatonic and then cycle through these things to kind of see what different things they do. I find that for low poly stuff, if you do an icosahedron with triangles and you set subdivisions to like 1, that is creating kind of a cool low poly thing. You can change this stuff to inflation or whatever. There's one thing that this is doing that is not really fitting with the low poly style, and that is smoothing everything. So one thing I like to do is create this type of object and then go to mesh display and do harden edge. And now that's going to create kind of a classic low poly aesthetic object. Now I want to make little low poly rocks. So what I'm going to do is go to my vertex mode and I'm going to press the B key to enter the soft select, and then hold down B and click and drag with the mouse to change the brush size. And then when you select one of these, you're kind of shifting the whole object around, which is kind of nice. So I'm just going to kind of mash this into an interesting shape that's kind of rock-like, I guess. I can change my selection. And I can also use the expand, scale tool to kind of change how that's working. I don't really mind that this has a rounded bottom because I'm going to just smush it into the ground. But if you were picky and you did want that, you could turn off soft select by pressing B and then grab a bunch of verts at the bottom and then just scale those flat. And now that's going to be flat. If you wanted to go to your different views and sync that up to the grid, then you could do that. So it's created kind of a rock type object. I'm actually going to undo those because I want it rounded so that I can kind of rotate this as much as I want and change it a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Now I'm going to do a couple things before I save this out, and this is kind of good practice. I'm going to zero this out in the grid, so I'm going to make sure it's kind of sitting in the grid. Depending on its offset, Maya will sometimes use the origin as the pivot point, and you may or may not want this. So when you have a single object like this, it's good to sort of orient it around whatever the pivot point is that you want. And then also there are two useful things to do. One of them, and this is just kind of a workflow thing inside of Maya, but it is kind of important to do on sometimes when you export as well. One of them is to delete history. So if I didn't want this construction history with all of these different modifiers, I can go to Edit, Delete by Type History, and that is going to simplify that down. And then I can also do, if you go to the channel box, you can see I'm offset from the origin. So you can go modify and freeze transformations, and that's going to zero out your component there. So those are good things to do just as a kind of last cleanup step before you export. I also want to add a different material to this, so it doesn't have that standard Lambert material. So I'm going to click on the rendering tab here and choose, doesn't really matter what I choose. Here's the thing about materials. Coming from Maya, most of the settings get ignored because the rendering system of Maya and the rendering system of Unity are just fundamentally different. So I'm just going to choose a Lambert material. I'm going to rename this to rock_M for material, just to keep things kind of named well. And I'm going to change the color just because some stuff does come across, and color is one of those things. So I'm going to make this just kind of a darkish browny gray, right there. And that should be good. The reason why we're not seeing color is because we don't have our textures on. So press the 6 key on the keyboard to turn those on. Okay, I'm going to export this now. Again, send to Unity, selection, and I'm just going to call this one rock. And now inside of my scene, I have a rock. Now I can drag this into the scene, but of course it's super tiny, so I'm going to click my scale factor and put this up to 100, and then hit apply. And now my rocks in my scene are looking kind of cool. So is there now a way to quickly replace these objects, the ones that I want to replace, with the rocks? Yes, there absolutely is, and you can do this, or you can instead drag and drop these new rocks in instead of those things. But let's say you wanted to swap out the mesh. Well, now if I click on one of these objects and click on my mesh filter here, I can drag and drop the mesh that is inside of this into this mesh filter. Or I can click the little target, and now this platonic one, which is the mesh, the name of the mesh, we didn't rename this in Maya, it's just here. We can select that, and it's going to update this and turn it into a mesh. Now it's got the same transform position and also the same material and the same box collider. And that kind of has an impact because as you're playing, you can now pass through it, which looks a little bit funky. So one thing we can do is, let's stick in ones here to put it back to the original size. One thing we can do is to change our collision to instead of a mesh here, we can, or instead of a box here, we can change it to be the specs of the mesh. So the way we do that is removing this box collider and instead adding a mesh collider. And if you have your, your mesh set up here, when this mesh collider gets created, it's going to use that same mesh. It's going to search and put it in. And it's a little bit hard to see, but our collision information is now matching the object. Mesh colliders are okay to use as long as you don't have objects that are super high poly. If you have a high poly object and you want a more complex collision, you'll actually sometimes make a special collision mesh, which is kind of exactly like a low poly version of that object. So we've done this the kind of fast way by creating a low poly object and then setting it as the mesh. But if we had a high poly version of this, we may want to use triangulated icosahedron to represent our collision mesh, because it's pretty efficient. So let's see if this works now and if collisions happen. Cool. So that is now colliding properly against the edge of the shape, and projectiles will as well. So what about materials? Well, we don't have this material assigned here. We can choose to, use the default rock material, but that's kind of limiting because it's using whatever material has been imported, and this material is not very sophisticated and we can't edit it. So one thing that's nice to do inside of Unity is to extract the materials. If you have a mesh or a model that has just a bunch of submeshes and a bunch of different materials, and you don't want to go about creating each individual material and making sure it's hooked up, you can click on your mesh, your model, and go to materials and then click extract materials. and you need to specify where those are going. So I'm going to put them in my materials folder, and then it is going to create those materials here. And it's also broken, this one, but we can just drag it back on. And now we can edit this material, so we can change the color if we don't like what it's doing, or we can add textures, which is exactly what we're going to do in a couple videos. So we covered here the basics of working between Maya and Unity. Working between Blender and Unity is much the same. If you're using a modeling sculpting tool like ZBrush or Mudbox, you still need to pay attention to the polygons that are coming into your scene. So typically a high density sculpt is millions of polygons. That's way too much for a scene to be able to render effectively. If you have multiple of those objects, if you have just one of those things in your scene, then maybe that's okay. But to have multiple of those scenes, way too high poly. So at some point you're going to have to retopologize it down to a lower poly count, and that's usually done in a program like Maya anyway. You can do this with like ZRemesher and ZBrush and bring it straight into Unity, but I usually use Maya or Blender as like a step just to clean stuff up, to rename things, to assign materials properly, and make sure everything is good to go before I bring it into Unity. So this video is getting nice and long, so I'm going to cut it off there, but in the next video what we're going to do is create the player character model that's going to be reusable for the enemies as well. And then I'm going to show you how to use the sort of hierarchy of a mesh and submeshes, or multiple meshes, I guess, to do some fancy things like aiming, and we're going to create a little tank here that's going to have a turret on top that aims independently of the rotation. So that's all for this video, and we'll pick it up in the next one with some more modeling.